Good afternoon, everybody. One of my favorite parts, definitely, about doing this is being able to meet different people who are sort of in the same community, who are obsessed with the same weird things that I'm obsessed with. That just can't help but look at the outskirts of life, so to speak, and see what lies beyond the normal perception. And we have one of those individuals with us today, someone I've spoken with a couple times over social media, and I just really dig the work that he does. Mr. Stroke of Moonlight, or as I referred to you when you came on, Lord Jacob. That works too. How you doing, dude?
Good, good. I'm good. How about you?
Like I said, I'm alive, and things can always be worse if that's the case.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, it's good. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's my first time ever doing something like this, so really cool opportunity, and I really appreciate it.
Of course, dude. Of course. I mean, it's you have work that speaks to people like myself, and naturally that brings up some interest. So I'd love to go ahead and
Mhm.
get into that.
Yeah.
So as far as your artwork is concerned, I mean, you've been around on the platform, like Instagram platform, which is where I initially first discovered you. You've been around there for about the same time that I have. Like some of the artwork, how would you describe what you try and get across with the work that you do? And in fact, what work do you do? Like what different forms do you use?
Well, I think my artwork is kind of, I think it's more in the dark art vein of art. A lot of it is also tied into Norse mythology. It's something that really interests me on both a spiritual level and just the myth in general. I think the biggest part of my work is that I focus on the concept of transcending through chaos. That's kind of like my banner line, and by that I mean it's not like a nihilistic idea of being in chaos and always surrounding yourself with it, but it's more of using chaos as a tool to gain some sort of personal gain.
Well, already, I'd have to say, I don't know if this will affect you at all, but I don't think Jordan Peterson would like what you just said very much. Uh, Transcendence through chaos, that doesn't sound right. But as someone who is also a part of that path, I like that perspective quite a bit because if you look at the world around you, you see essentially nothing but chaos. And there is
Yeah.
order in that chaos to some degree, but I think one of the pivotal parts about like Norse spirituality is using that chaos to build something what you perceive as being beautiful outside of that. And I definitely think you take a look at your work, you can see that sort of influence and things like that. So do you really just stick to like the realm of painting or digital design? Like what forms does your art take?
Most of my artwork is digital. I do also like to work with 3D sculpture based work. I've created some customized runes in the past, some skull stuff. I created little ones that are little molten embers that are taken from Muspelheim. At least that's the concept behind them. So I do some sculpture stuff like that as well, but my main focus is the digital artwork.
That's a realm that's really been popping off. I think it's really only been made as available as it is now, but you see all kinds of different people taking the digital space and turning it into something archaic looking or something that is a callback to the old ways. And I think that's like I spoke to Saint Saturday recently, and that was one of the things that he had mentioned, like with a lot of the painting that he does, is he will take older works that no longer serve their purpose, like he kind of treats it as a ritual, which is part of art, and he will burn them and use the ash to create something new. And I think that's an incredibly inspiring prospect, especially when you're doing work with runes, since a lot of runes are associated with death. I mean, look at the origin story about how we got the runes. They involved death and sacrifice in order for them to exist in the first place. I think that's a very applicable realm as far as working with the digital space is concerned too. Would you agree with that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I am definitely a big fan of Saint Saturday as well. I was actually listening to, I think it was maybe your second podcast that you had him on, maybe your third, I don't quite remember, but definitely had an impact on me. But yeah, I definitely say that that kind of theme is something that is also, in my work as well. That, that destruction, that chaos, and taking that and then putting it into something new, much like you said, of the burning of the older pieces and then using the ash to rebuild and use into a new piece. I think that's yes, definitely something that my art reflects.
specifically that conversation that I had with him, I remember sitting there speaking with him and like hearing him tell me about his artistic process. It was almost sublime a little bit. It was incredibly inspiring to sit here and listen to
Hmm.
him speak about. So at that time, that was quite some time ago at this point. I think that was like the eighth episode I did. And
Yeah,
at
I think
that
so.
time, yeah, at that time, I really didn't have much of an idea of what I wanted this to be. But that conversation
Mhm.
specifically speaking about the life death cycle and how he incorporates that within his artwork, that was really what sprung me to reach out and to think a little bit more about the platform that I use, and not just the platform that I use, but the purpose behind it. Like, what sort of message, what sort of archetype do I want to represent with the things that I'm doing? And artwork like that, I really do wish let me just say, I admire the hell out of you guys, the ones who are very talented with the digital space or with painting or with sculptures, even. I'm just not the kind of guy for that. I like to talk. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Uh, that's about it.
I
But
appreciate that. Thank you.
of course.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's not quite that far away from each other. I think both are a form of communication. Obviously, words are our main use of communication, but I think we also communicate a lot with our eyes. And I think, especially when we're, face to face, we're maintaining eye contact. We can read a lot of emotion and a lot of things that are happening within the eyes as well. So I think that's also something that is also a form of communication. And when you view it in a visual arts perspective, I think our eyes interpreting whatever story is being presented to us is in fact a form of communication as well.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anybody could argue that. I mean, the
Mhm.
communication, nonverbal communication is much more powerful than verbal communication is in most instances. Sort of the
I agree.
same, putting on a show like a public speaking event, like take a politician, for example, someone who stands up on stage and uses their body language, that communicates more to the audience, so to speak, than the actual substance of what they're saying does. And that principle very well is found in artwork. I mean, you can tell a story with an image, and I would say like more quickly than you can sitting there and dictating something to someone verbally. And in fact, if you look at something, a lot of times, like, and this is a scientifically verified thing, we associate different images and different colors with emotion, like our emotional
Mhm.
connection. And that form of storytelling, we can just look at history. Any society that has existed anywhere, art has been a central form of how that society expresses themselves.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely think that that art is almost like the philosopher's stone of a society. I think that most of the things that a society holds most dear, whether it's its values or its ideals or religious aspects, you'll see that in art that is produced, and it will all one of those basic views that can't be really explained as well through words or through writing.
Incredibly powerful. Like, just looking at some of the examples of the artwork that you have and the incorporation of like color tones and things of that nature. And there's this sort of, and one of the reasons, especially if the art is involved with some sort of spiritual aspect, you can, like, Jung spoke about this a lot, the sort of suppressed subconsciousness that we have within us and divinity that is within us, sort of this repressed identity that we have. Artwork, specifically like visual artwork, is an incredible tool to actually bring that out and express that. And we become a little bit more aware of that when we see what's being repressed in us on a canvas or on a social media page or whatever the form it may take. There are a number of things that are we're taught or we are conditioned to repress within us, and artwork is an incredible medium in terms of like actually bringing that out and extracting that and showing it out to an audience.
Hmm. For sure.
So I did want to ask, like, artists of all kinds, sometimes we have this tendency towards it, with the more verbally minded folks like myself. We just kind of discovered at an early age that we took pleasure in speaking and telling stories and things like that. I think that applies to all art forms, though. There's always this sort of genesis moment that you have, and you sort of discover which path that you want to go down. What did that look like for you in terms of like how did you put together your own artistic identity and carry that
Um,
path down?
that's a great question. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time in the hospital due to some health stuff. So I had a lot of free time. Obviously, I wasn't able to go anywhere. So I would draw a lot, different pictures, childhood stuff. And then I started watching a lot of Tim Burton, which is typical,
Little
and
goth kid, that's
really,
funny.
really influenced by Tim Burton. Oh my God, loved him when I was a kid. But it wasn't until I was probably about 12, and I came across my first box set of Warhammer, the miniature game. And I started painting those, and my dad had also been interested in Warhammer when he was a kid, so he had a bunch of different painting techniques that he had picked up throughout his childhood. So me and him would, get together and we would paint our Warhammer together, and he would teach me, some different techniques and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of where my love for art really started flourishing. Um, and then from there, I started branching off and doing into my own kind of style, and it's been growing since then. So I think yeah, that's definitely where it first started.
As far as like, it's funny that you bring up Tim Burton because I think just about all of us who have an interest in darker or like alternative forms of art can cite Tim Burton as being an influence in some degree or another. Just that art style is so influential. He's on to me,
It
he's on
is.
par with like the Edgar Allan Poe's for the
Oh, for
poetically
sure.
inclined. Yeah, so
Yep.
it sort of represents the same archetype, like aesthetically wise, like that's what it speaks to. And what about that style appealed to you? Because not obviously, just like the work that I do isn't going to appeal to everyone, because not everyone is interested in talking about Hermeticism, unfortunately, or paganism. But in the same vein, your artwork speaks to a suppressed identity within a lot of people that doesn't resonate with everyone. But those who it really
No, it does
resonates
not.
with, they're dedicated. They will in
Yeah.
fact cling on to it.
I guess I guess what I found inspiring about Tim Burton is that he was able to kind of craft this outworld, like this kind of darker world, but he did it in, I want to say, almost like a cartoony way. But it was more than that. It was the characters that he was creating. I think that really kind of caught my attention. I think he focused a little bit more on the outcasts and the misfits of the world, and I kind of felt like that during my time when I was growing up, a little bit of an outcast and a misfit, someone that didn't really quite fit into the rest of society. So I think I just found a little bit of relatability to some of his characters, and some of like the Nightmare for a Christmas Dog, like so cute, like different things like that. All of his characters are just filled with emotion in their own right, and I think that really really struck home to me.
And incredibly iconic, might I add too. I mean, a
Yes.
lot of a lot of his work. What's very fascinating about like Edgar Allan Poe and Tim Burton, to use those two as an example.
Hmm.
When I was in like, I remember studying briefly, just a little bit of like poetry and things like that in a standard education, like in a high school. And we're both in the United States, so we know that that's generally not something that our education, our formal education, focuses on too much prior to
Right.
college and all that if you choose to go down that route. But I remember
Hmm.
there was a semester, I think in my junior year, in my English class, where we spoke at length and we would read Edgar Allan Poe's work. And I found that very fascinating. I was like, the heroin addict, that guy? I was like, this is a standard education practice now. And you talk about a misfit. This is someone who really had no recognition at all until he died, very
Yeah.
little. And he was strung out on his day to day life, and he died relatively young, too.
Hmm.
Is complete outcast by that society's standards. And Tim Burton, at first glance, is sort of in the same vein. Someone who uses these darker color palettes, who uses these clay-esque little models that are, to use the word spooky, a little
Hmm.
more, they appeal to a different aesthetic than most of their art does. Yet at the same time, Edgar Allan Poe and Tim Burton are like just known all over the world, even taught about in public schools, which is
Yep.
very fascinating because you don't see a whole lot of artwork that takes that sort of style being implemented in.
No, you don't. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what it is about, Tim Burton's work and how he's so world renowned, but I definitely feel like it's because everyone can kind of relate to what he's trying to portray. Everyone understands the negative emotions. Everyone gets them. Everyone, feels them. Um, So I think it's easy for us to connect with those characters that he creates that are a little bit more towards the gothy side, if you can use that word. But yeah, I think a lot of people can just find a lot of ability to relate to them. It's just they're great characters.
Great characters, and that transcends the style. You know, the literary style, the way that the characters are written,
Yep.
they appeal to a wide audience as well. And I think it's funny to contrast that. And this can be definitely argued, but you can look at more popular forms of media like the Marvel series, and you have a completely different character style there. A lot of these characters aren't nearly as in depth. They're not written in the same sort of way, but they appeal
Yeah.
more visually speaking to our senses than characters like Tim
Yes.
Burton's characters, because they're made to not be very pleasing to look at. So a lot of them look
No.
like
Yeah.
corpses. Yeah, so
Right.
they're not visually appealing, but their substance as characters and the trials that they go through, the way that the story is written, the
Mhm.
literature itself and the scripts and all these things, they appeal to our emotional capacity in that sort of way, which I think is an
Yeah.
interesting difference to
I
point
think
out
they just
there.
come off a little bit more human.
Exactly.
Kind of the Avengers style thing. They just don't lack. They don't have that depth that Tim Burton's characters bring.
Yeah, there's something about a Tim Burton style character or a film that appeals to me more than a ripped, muscly green man. As much
Yeah.
as much as I'd like to be a ripped, muscly green man,
Right.
I'm not that, but I am
No.
human, so that is a little easier to pick up on.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely agree.
As far as like your art style, like I keep referring back to your page because
Mhm.
I do really admire the style a lot. Your work with runes, and I see that you've used a lot
Yep.
of like bones and physical body parts, which in terms of people making their own runes and creating them, use of biological material, whether it be like saliva or blood or bones, even. That's pretty
Mhm.
prevalent. A lot of people will sanctify them or clean them or cleanse them or just personalize them in a way that makes them unique to the person creating the runes. In
Right.
what way do you implement that in your artwork, and why the runes specifically? Like, is there a spiritual component to that you personally express through it?
Yeah, I definitely say that there's a little bit of a spiritual aspect to it. So I think the thing about the runes is, using bones, blood, and saliva, like you'd already mentioned. It's kind of like a reenactment or a recreation of the whole Ymir story of when Odin, Beli, and V, ripped apart Ymir to build a world that they saw fit. I think it kind of mirrors that same idea. Just, you're recreating the story of Ymir. All right, so I'd say, using bones, saliva, blood, that kind of idea within the runes is it's recreating the story of Odin, Vili, and V and Ymir within Genindagap. So they, ripped apart Ymir and rebuilt the world in their fashion. I think that's kind of replicated in the use of bones in my artwork to portray to that story as if you're ripping apart the old and rebuilding the new.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the way that I approach them too, and just in terms of like understanding them, sort of using them to manifest or bring about change within your own life, or using them and really gaining an understanding of them, so that I mean, just yesterday, the little video that I posted, when I went up to a spot that's close to me, something that I consider like my spiritual home is Mount Baldy, and I took a spot up there, and with the understanding that it took Odin to sacrifice himself in order to truly understand the
Mhm.
runes and to write them out, really wanted to get a grasp on how these things work and how this one specific rune that I was focusing on, like what is the concept behind this? What does this mean to me? But also, what could this mean to the person that wrote them, the God that created them?
Mhm.
And seeing like the outside perspective of that and how it applies to you. And personally, what I find so inspiring about rune work is that it's personalized in that you make of them, also like your origin story is important too, but you use them to create something yourself, much like an artist does when they create a painting. But you're using
Mhm.
these ancestral, you can call it an ancestral alphabet, but it's a spiritual alphabet more so than a written one. That's what the younger Futhark is for. But it's just interesting and very inspiring to be able to use these ancient tools, and they still apply now, very much so, and they're
Yeah.
everywhere. They're everywhere, all over popular culture, all over popular media. You see them implemented even like stupid clothing brands that you see at like Tilly's or something. Like
Yeah.
they're there, but a lot of people don't take a second to really understand or even look beyond. It's sort of like it reminds me of the Thrasher hoodies with the big old pentagram in the middle
Yes.
of them.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, do you really know what that is, or do you, I always find that interesting. I in it,
It is.
yeah.
I don't know if it's the tabooness of it of that we kind of recognize kind of what it is, but I don't think the regular person who doesn't study these things wouldn't understand it on the bigger scheme. But I think something about it just kind of clicks with us. We recognize these things without truly understanding them, but I still think that they resonate slightly with certain types of people.
And that can be taken back to Jung's work with the shadow, and a lot of these repressed
Yeah.
identities that we have that we don't, especially of a more sinister or dark nature. As much as I hate using that term, I feel like a 13-year-old when I say that, but it's it's still very much applicable. I mean, I there's nothing more ironic to me than seeing a bunch of kids, and I see this all the time being in California. It's sort of part of the pop culture here, is seeing a kid with a black Thrasher hoodie with a big old pentagram in the middle of it, and then a cross necklace hanging right above it. It's like
Yeah.
got a
Like what? Yeah.
got
One
a
of
walking
those.
contradiction here, everybody.
Yes. Yeah.
But I find it interesting in that regard. And I sort of mentioned this in my discussion with Nicholas, who I keep endlessly referring to, and I will keep referring to it because it was a good discussion. But I had mentioned to him, and as someone who has an interest in these sorts of things, I would love to hear your input on it. And also
Mhm.
being in a different part of the world than myself, you saw a lot with like the Satanic Panic era. A lot of the people who represented quote unquote Satanism back in the 80s and 90s spoke about this coming satanic age is sort of like this like, spooky thing that's going to be coming in the turn of the millennia in 2000. And I
Mhm.
think that even though a lot of that work, like a lot of Anton LaVey stuff, was heavily plagiarized and didn't even belong to him, and he himself is not a reliable source of anything,
Mhm.
but I do think that that actually came to fruition a little bit. You know, you see artwork that is, of course, not as like extreme as yours that incorporates these very ancient things that most people, if you take a look at it, it won't resonate with them the same way it does with someone like myself or the rest of the people that follow you and buy your work because they understand the historical and ancient significance of these things. But you see things like the pentagram, or you see things like Lucifer Sigil, even. You see these things like posted all over popular clothing brands. And a lot of these ideologies, like the LaVeyan philosophy, is represented in popular culture now. So I think
Mhm.
to a degree, this quote unquote satanic age that we're in is in fact real. I do think that actually did end up happening.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I definitely have noticed a rise in dark art in general. I see a lot more artists focusing on, the darker aspects of things, which I don't think is, a bad thing. I think we as a society are kind of losing touch with who we are as humans, like at the core, because of all the technology that is permeating right now. And I think that a lot of us are looking for, answers of why we're unhappy. And I think it's because we're putting off a lot of our darker aspects, our I guess you could say id, even though that's not quite the correct term, but a lot of us are just out of touch with our inner selves, especially with all of the um, dopamine buttons that are all over the place, cell phones, porn, so easily accessible. We have fast food. We have everything that we could ever want right at our fingertips, and our brains are just overfilled with dopamine. And I think it's starting to wear on us. And I think we're looking for the darker parts to ground us and bring us back into that proper human psyche.
Absolutely. I think one particular artist that I've seen, you can say appropriated, but I've seen his work be pasted all over social media, even among it's Zdzislaw Beksinski. I see his work posted all over the place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I mean, he's one of my personal favorites. You gotta love those polls.
yeah.
Love that artwork, and I love what it stands for. And actually looking at the person's life, his tragic death. He was
Yeah.
essentially, yeah, killed by some fool who was trying to get money off of him for probably drugs or something like that.
Yep.
It was just the artwork that he created was a reflection of the of wartime Poland and what he lived through and what he survived
Hmm.
living in that region. And just like art always has, it's an extension of the person creating it. It's an extension of their experiences, of their I wouldn't say repressed to that degree because obviously they're expressing them, but it's
Right.
portrays a very grim aspect of life, a very grim emotion or time that someone went through or they experienced. And I definitely do think that this overload of dopamine that we're living in, it's incredibly damaging long term. You know, you're dealing
Yep.
with a lot of these negative emotions that you are slowly building up, but because you have all these dopamine hits that you can look to at any given time, you start to minimize the negative a
Yep.
bit more.
Or further suppress it with
Exactly.
all the dopamine. Yeah.
Because that pleasure is so right there to be had, you know, it's a little difficult to really dig deep and find where a lot of those issues started.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think that's why there's a little bit of an increase in people looking at dark art, let alone, people creating it. But I feel like there's a lot of people that are becoming more interested in dark art, whether it's, through their finding of Tim Burton, which I've talked to a lot of people and found that they've developed a taste for dark art because of Tim Burton. Just to bring the conversation back to our earlier conversation. Um, but I think it's also just because we've fallen out of touch with, what it means to be human, and we're looking for that grounding source. And I think dark art really touches a nerve that, the regular happier art, in quotations, if you want to say that, um, isn't bringing people, because we're so filled with happiness all the time that we don't get to really look inwards and realize that there is despair, in life, but that's okay. It's a part of life, and you need to have the despair with the happiness to find that balance. Without one, you're just spending your time in the other, and spending too much time in one or the other is detrimental.
I think I would even take it further and say we aren't filled up with happiness necessarily. It's more so the facade or appearance of happiness
Yes. Yeah.
because everything is so immediate. I mean, you take away someone, it's sort of the whole neglecting the process and just jumping straight to the result. You know, you're
Mhm.
out toiling the fields and producing crops or even creating something like an art, like a piece of art. The process is what's fulfilling about the entire process. Like me sitting here speaking with you and exchanging dialogue, this is the part that I enjoy the most. Of course, I love to see discussions around things and get messages and build the conversations up from there. But the process of creating something, the process of putting your efforts in and having the rewards come afterward, you can't
Mhm.
neglect the process and expect the result to be as satisfying. That's essentially
No.
what it comes down to.
Yeah.
You cook yourself a meal, it's a lot more satisfying than rolling up through a drive-through. And although that immediate moment of greasy McDonald's fries hitting your palate, it might be satisfying in the moment, but the stomach issues and pain, we
Yes.
can say later
Afterwards.
on,
Yeah.
that's that's your reward for taking
Yeah.
the easy route out.
Yeah. 100%. I was going to ask you, through the creation process, when you sit down and you start your writing, would you say that's a meditative process for you?
Absolutely. I think what it can kind of be broken down into, and I was thinking about this yesterday, although I didn't kind of note it in the video thing that I made. The meditation, the practice of meditation is a lot less formal than sitting there, your legs crossed, and you focus on your breathing. That is one technique, but it's sort
Hmm.
of like within mixed martial arts, it's called the state of flow, where you find your flow and the combinations that you're putting together, the head kicks, the leg kicks, the body shots, the punches to the face, like the angles that you're cutting, grappling. It all becomes one continuous process and it all flows together. The same way, like when you're in an engaging dialogue with somebody, you're speaking with them, nodes are firing off, ideas are coming up to your head. It does become very meditative because you become aware of yourself in that moment and you become aware of what you're saying and you become aware of the messages being communicated back and forth. And I think ultimately that's kind of what meditation comes down to. I just had a conversation yesterday and that came up. It's like the meditation process is awareness, being aware of the moment, being aware of yourself in that moment, your bodily sensations. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. So absolutely, I think it is very meditative, and I would extend that question to you as well, and sort of your response on that. Is your creative process equally as meditative, or does it, it impact you in a different sort of way?
No, I would say that it is very, very meditative. When I sit down and prepare my work, I'm usually, in the basement. I like to keep things a little bit darker just so that there isn't so much stimulation on my eyes because I'm working with a computer most of the time. So there's a lot of light coming out from there. So just to sit in like a darkened room, not a dark room, darkened room, really kind of, calms the mind a little bit. And then once you start doing the actual creative process, I can feel time kind of stop. And as I'm working, I'll actually look down at the clock and realize that 3 hours has passed, and I haven't realized it at all. I've just finished my painting. And it becomes just a very, in the moment you're creating, you kind of just lose yourself a little bit. I wouldn't say it's like ego death or anything like that, but you kind of lose everything except for what you're doing in the moment. So yeah, I would say that it is very meditative.
It can become an ego death to some extent on a smaller scale, in that what you're focusing on, you're really focusing on, and a lot of the distractions and noise sort of fades away a little bit. And those moments of bliss, which is what I consider them, because I myself am a pretty erratic person most of the time.
Yeah.
I have built up some more negative habits of like constantly watching something or constantly listening to something. And this is a conversation I had with someone close to me, not like pretty recently. And he spoke about the same thing. He's like, I'll be sitting there listening to a podcast, thinking about another podcast, thinking about something I want to write later, thinking about what I want to eat for dinner, thinking about what my kid's doing. It's like when you get
Yeah.
stuck in this process. And for me, speaking to people like this is almost a form of therapy, the same way painting something or writing something is too, because I can sit there and just let the stream of consciousness flow out. Like I've gotten a little bit of criticism for it, but I do speak relatively quickly, and I speak with intent too. But
Mhm.
there's a purpose behind that. It's because there's so many different ideas and so many different things happening, and if I don't let them out, they're just going to sit there and rot you away, which I think any artist of any kind, I think, can kind of agree with. Like if you don't express these things, they'll just sit there and stew within you, and you become the anxiety like focused around doing this thing rather than actually doing the thing.
Yeah, that is very, very accurate. Yeah, I can definitely relate to all of those things, especially with the thoughts. Imagine like how many thoughts does one human have a day? Thousands. It's very hard to keep your thoughts from controlling you sometimes, and I definitely think that people need some sort of meditative device to kind of filter those thoughts and allow them to kind of dissipate for a little bit so that you can focus on one specific thing with effectiveness and have the rest of those thoughts kind of at bay for the time being, and once you're done one thought you can move on to the next one.
I think the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer kind of talked about this a little bit too. It's this sort of the concept behind like what is the meaning of life, and of course there are a million different answers to that question. But ultimately, what kind of like the conclusion that he came to, and this is just a very brief summary, but we're essentially slaves to our instincts to reproduce and survive, and essentially everything that we do falls under that banner: being slaves to reproduction, being slaves to our biological instincts to survive. And I think the awareness of that, being aware of the fact that why am I'm listening to one thing, thinking about it another thing while doing that. All of these processes can be boiled down into my mind is in a million different states right now. I'm trying to go in a million different directions, and I just need to relax. I just need to calm down. The hits of dopamine
Mhm.
are making this way worse than they need to be. Like I need to just separate myself from something. And in your case, which I'll be honest, I deeply admire, being able to just sit there and work on something for 3 hours and not even recognize the time going by. Because I'll be
Mhm.
the first one to admit, if I sit there and I'm working on something, especially if I'm not super motivated to do it, I'll notice right away just how much time is passing by. Like, I really wish I was out doing something different. I wish I was playing a video game or something far less productive, but you can't allow yourself to get stuck in that trap for
No,
too
you
long.
can't. I definitely fall victim to that as well, and there are times that I don't feel like creating, but no, I have to create anyway, whether I have a project or a commission or something like that. But I find that once I focus on doing that one task, and about half an hour into the project, once I'll have all those, I want to play video games, so I think I need to get a cup of coffee. Oh no, I need to go to the bathroom. All those different thoughts are going through my head. And about half an hour into it, they kind of cease, and that's when the time kind of stops, and I kind of get into that artist flow, if you will. And yeah, that's when the time starts to slip away.
I definitely think one of the things that I think we can leave this conversation with and kind of round out on is the concept of like how do you get yourself to sit there and actually do the thing? I've been speaking with a number of people recently, especially with the whole global pandemic thing, which gets brought up endlessly, but I think it's applicable here. You're seeing like this lack of motivation a lot of people are experiencing,
Hmm.
and they are allowing themselves to essentially become slaves to their emotions. It's sort of like I keep seeing this recurring post, and essentially the idea is I don't feel motivated to do this thing and I'm upset about it, and that's essentially it. Like I don't feel motivated to do this, and that's the end of the post. It's like, okay, you can lack motivation as much as you want.
Hmm.
The issue comes when you value your lack of motivation more than the discipline it requires to do things. You need to find a way to just get up and keep going.
Oh,
And
for sure.
I would like to ask, how have you been able to implement that idea? It sort of just boils down to discipline and not valuing the stimulation that your mind is experiencing with a million
Hmm.
different things and just getting yourself.
That's a good question. I think part of it is, I know that I don't want to spend my life, sitting in front of a TV or video games or anything like that. There's something I want to achieve within my very limited time being here. And I think that's one of the things about being an artist is that creation that you have, the ability to create is the most I think, divine thing that we have. And unfortunately, due to our own mortality, we only have a certain amount of time to create. So, I like to try and, value that gift that was given to me by being a creator and an artist. And I want to be able to create as much as I can while I'm still here. And we know that our time is limited. We're not sure when it's going to be. I could live for 100 years, or I could live until I'm 30. I don't know. So I like to make sure that I'm keeping myself motivated. And even on those days that I don't feel motivated, when I go sit in front of my computer and I kind of, think things over, okay, what am I going to create today? What kind of themes do I want to touch on today? Or do I want to talk about a certain mythology or whatever it is I'm trying to convey in that piece? The cogs start to turn. And when the cogs start to turn, I kind of, get excited by the creative process, and it makes me want to create more. And before I know it, I'm back into that creative flow and I am in my meditative state. So I think it's just appreciating that, we only have a limited amount of time on this world to do whatever it is that we want to do. And that once we decide that's what we're going to do, it's our brains are very powerful, and we can definitely create things when we sit down and we actually put our minds to it.
All comes down to discipline, putting your mind to it, and making sure that you make the most of the limited time that you have. Because, like you said,
Yeah.
you never truly know when it's going to end and when it's going to be all over. Because that's just our state. That's just what
Yep.
we've been blessed with, is the gift of knowing that we're going to die at some point.
Yep. Yep. We live in a world of dualities. I think it's always important to remember that.
And the gray zones right in between those dualities too. We're always in a state of constantly moving and changing
Yep.
and becoming. And I think that's an excellent point to like that can round out this entire conversation. That's what we
Yep.
can leave with. So I
Perfect.
really appreciate you coming on, Lord Jacob. I'm going to keep calling you that. That's your name from now on. But
Thank you so much for having me.
of course, this is the time for you to plug. Of course, I'm a big fan of the work that you're doing, and I would love for anybody else who's listening who's interested in this sort of stuff, which you should be. You should check it out anyway, even if you're not, do it anyway. But for anybody who wants to find you, where can they find your stuff at?
They can find me on Instagram. That's where I do most of my uploads at Stroke of Moonlight. And then you can also find me online if you want to buy anything from me at strokeofmoonlight.com. Yeah.
I really appreciate it, Lord Jacob. I'll be speaking to you soon, dude.
All right. Thank you so much.